Hello and welcome to Working Historians, a podcast about what historians do with their lives. I am Rob Denning, the faculty lead for history for Southern New Hampshire University's Global Campus. We have reached a bunch of milestones lately, which has caused us to rethink the way we organize and approach these various podcast series. I started filibustering history almost 2 years ago to help the students of Southern New Hampshire University see the diverse career paths open to them after graduation, and to give them ammunition to use when family and friends ask them why they're wasting their lives and tuition dollars on the study of history. Elizabeth Burbridge, Natalie Sweet, and James Fennessy started the Navigating History and History Soundbites podcasts around the same time as a way to discuss and share the skills of the historian and for instructors at SNHU to present their research to students and to larger audiences. Even though all of these series were on the same podcast feed, we kept them largely separated from each other until a few months ago, when we combined them under the umbrella name of Working Historians. Now, I mentioned milestones a few minutes ago, and we've been at this for 2 years now. This is our 62nd episode, if you tally up all of our recordings for all of the podcast series. That is, if I'm doing the math right. I tried to count twice and came up with different numbers, so whatever, maybe I'm off. But we are now reaching a broader audience than we ever expected, with nearly 1,000 plays and downloads last month alone. More listeners now come from outside the SNHU community than from within. I have talked to lots of students and newly minted historians via social media and other places about their adventures in history-related careers, and we have lots of stories left to tell and lots of people left to talk to. We're not going anywhere for the foreseeable future. Well, kinda. James left SNHU a couple months ago for a really cool new job that must unfortunately remain secret for the time being, but he will continue to call in to our undersea pirate broadcasting station now and then to help me talk to people whenever possible. But beyond that, we're not going anywhere. So, with all of that in mind, we are going to streamline and reorganize the podcast a little bit. From now on, we are going to use the Working Historians title for every episode, and we will move away from the old, increasingly arbitrary dividing line between filibustering history and history soundbites. For the MBAs in the audience, I think that's synergy? I don't know, maybe not. I don't really know what synergy is, but maybe. Anyway, that was a long, drawn-out explanation, I suppose. But the big picture is that we're going to be calling this Working Historians from now on, rather than the old names of filibustering history and history soundbites. Okay, so that's done. Let's move on to what everybody has been waiting for and why everybody is listening to this episode. Today, James and I are talking to Brian Cervantez, an associate professor of history at Tarrant County College in Texas, who will next year publish a book titled Amon Carter, A Lone Star Life. Today we're going to find out just who this Amon guy was and why we should care. Welcome, Brian. Can you give us a little bit of background on yourself, and then we will talk about the project?
Sure. I've been doing history pretty much my entire adult life. I majored in history at my undergraduate institution, where I went to Texas Christian University. After that, I went straight into my master's and then PhD, and earned both of those degrees at the University of North Texas, up in Denton, Texas. And while at UNT, I primarily specialized in modern U.S. / the New South. So just kind of an American Southern historian with some a little bit more narrower focus on Texas history, though I generally kind of fit that Texas history under the umbrella of Southern history. And so I did that while I was, or after I completed my master's degree. I was successful in landing a full-time job at Tarrant County College, community college down here, primarily located in Fort Worth, and have been there for about 13, 14 years. I've been teaching, studying history, like I said, really since I was 18 years old.
And so given your background with Texas, when you were going through grad school and all that, were your research focuses probably on Texas and the Southwest then? Anything in particular?
Well, my dissertation was actually a biography of the individual we'll be talking about today, Amon G. Carter. But in addition to that, I really concentrated a lot on the Great Depression and New Deal era, both in Texas and just broadly speaking throughout the South. You know, there is quite a bit of Texas focus in there, though I don't think I would necessarily categorize myself in particular as a Texas historian, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Our I think our academic experience was kind of similar. I went to school out in California for my BA and my MA. My thesis and then later my dissertation, which I did in Ohio, but it was on California, kind of California and the broader West, focusing on themes like immigration, environmental protection, that kind of thing. So I think we kind of had similar backgrounds, just different megastates.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a lot of my work, especially related to Carter, has been on trying to fit him into a larger national context as well as a regional context, both as a really an example of how his particular part of Texas, Fort Worth, really is this region where South and West meet culturally, economically, things like that. It is kind of this where the two regional attitudes clash, I guess is one way to put it. And maybe not so much clash, maybe meld together. And so his life is in many ways representative of that meeting of South and West. So hard to really categorize him as explicitly Southern or explicitly Western. Just trying to present him as kind of part of that larger phenomenon of what it means to be Southwestern.
Great. Okay. And I look forward to kind of getting into that as we move along here. So first off, we're talking to you because you are on the verge of publishing a book. What's the name of the book and when can we expect it to come out?
The book is titled Amon G. Carter, A Lone Star Life, and it's coming out in February of 2019, published by University of Oklahoma Press. Something I've been kind of working on with them for the last, really, I guess I'd say that's been about a year and a half, almost 2 years. And it's been kind of a lengthy process. Like I said, it was originally, at least at the heart of it, my dissertation. I finished PhD work and graduated with my PhD at the end of 2011. So it's been several years, primarily since, like I said, I've had a full-time job. My teaching load, is a 5/5 teaching load, and so that doesn't always leave a lot of time for research and writing. So it didn't come out as quickly as I'd hoped, but finally completed. So very happy about that.
Yeah, I bet. I graduated in 2011 also. We've got all kinds of parallels going here.
Yeah, definitely.
I have not gotten back to my dissertation yet. It's one of those things I keep thinking I need to get back to that. I should really publish that just so I can have a book out there in the world, but whatever.
Yeah, it's one where I really had to take off little bites here and there. It wasn't something where I was able to just sit down and say, you know what, this semester I'm focusing on getting that book ready. Hadn't had that luxury, so it's taking, like I said, taking those little small bites. But it's been an enjoyable process. I'd say getting it ready for publication was not quite as painful as I feared it might be.
Good.
But I think it's because I had some great people to work with at OU Press.
That helps, yeah.
And that makes all the difference.
Yeah, great. I'm glad that process worked smoothly for you. So let's get into the content of the book. So who is this guy, Amon Carter, and why is he significant?
Yeah, well, Amon G. Carter is not so much a nationally known name today, not a name you're going to really hear in too many circles unless maybe you're interested in things like Western art and something like that, since he was a major collector of the work of Frederick Remington and Charles Russell. But in his day, and he lived from 1879 to 1955, he was really the premier newspaper publisher in Texas and really the Southwest. He started and ran the Fort Worth Star-Telegram from 1909 until his death in 1955. And in those years, really by the 1920s until his death in the 1950s, the Star-Telegram was the most widely circulated newspaper in Texas and the Southwest. And of course, this is back when newspapers enjoyed quite a little bit more prestige than nowadays. Newspaper publishers obviously wielded a great amount of influence in a variety of ways. So what this did was it made Carter particularly useful in the realm of civic boosting. One of the things he really devoted a lot of his efforts to, in addition to running the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, was he really primarily focused on being a Fort Worth booster in a lot of ways, trying to find ways to attract businesses to Fort Worth, trying to find ways to take advantage of federal largesse whenever that was available, and really became kind of the singular representative of Fort Worth to the rest of the United States. And so you see him hobnobbing with corporate bigwigs. He hangs out with presidents like Roosevelt and Eisenhower. He becomes incredibly great friends with very national figures like Will Rogers, things like that. So, during his heyday, which was really from the 1920s to the 1950s, he was someone that Americans would have had a basic amount of familiarity with because they would encounter him in a variety of settings. I mentioned his friendship with Will Rogers. Will Rogers wrote the most widely read syndicated column that appeared in newspapers in the late 20s until his death in 1935. And Carter was a constant presence in his columns. Rogers would be regaling readers with some of their latest antics and actions and things like that. Time magazine did a number of profiles on him. So, like I said, today, not necessarily a nationally recognized figure, but during the peak of his career, he was definitely someone a large number of Americans would have at least had some idea of who he was and what he was about.
That's an interesting contrast to today because, of course, today the vast majority of people have no idea who newspaper publishers are. And part of that might be the decline of newspapers in general, but also there's probably other factors at play also. But it does seem to be the case that especially back in the early 20th century, newspaper publishers were in many ways, like you said, they were civic leaders, but they were also kind of larger than life. They were people that just common people would know about, which seems so strange from a modern perspective. But I encounter this in my own work, reading about, even as late as the 1950s, 1960s, when you're talking about places like Los Angeles or Sacramento out in California, there's these names that, they're not politicians, they're not entertainment people, they're not actors or anything like that. So it's just crazy that people all knew who all these people were. But at the same time, we have no idea who these people are today. It's a very odd change in history.
Yeah, I'd hesitate to maybe call them celebrities because that brings up different connotations, but these were almost celebrities in their own right. They were, whether you're talking about, Otis out in L.A. or Carter, or you're talking about Robert McCormick up in Chicago, or obviously the most famous, William Randolph Hearst. These were incredibly well-known individuals that, like you said, that just isn't present in the modern world. And so I found that to be an incredibly fascinating insight into the past because it is, while it is the recent past, that is a world that really doesn't exist anymore. The idea of the preeminence and influence of these newspapers. I think it's kind of sad to see that era disappear. There's just something I think about newspapers, maybe something a little romantic about it. So it is interesting to kind of see that world fade away and get replaced by who knows what we're heading into.
Right. And I wonder, and this is probably going a little bit beyond the kind of the scope of your study of the guy, but I wonder if that says something about general cynicism that we have today, because when you're thinking of boosters, in today's modern days, someone that's kind of out there rah-rah-rahing about their city and all of that, a lot of people just kind of roll their eyes at that. But back in those earlier generations, that was, a lot of people responded positively to that they are boosters, they're drawing people here, they're advertising, they're bringing in industry and all of that. And so it just feels like there's just been such a shift lately towards, I don't know if cynicism is the right word, but just not as... That type of thing just doesn't appeal to a lot of people anymore.
It really doesn't. I think there is, a kind of natural reaction nowadays to this feeling that maybe people are being sold a bill of goods, by these individuals. At least that would be the modern perception. So there would be this sense that, maybe you really couldn't take them at their word. And yes, clearly they're incredibly biased in favor of whatever community it is they're boosting. So, if that's going to be the case, then we really don't need to take these people too seriously. But, like you said, in the past, that was something that was just kind of par for the course. I mean, you would expect that your city should have its boosters out there trying to attract business, trying to encourage growth, trying to take advantage of, whatever federal legislation and monies might be out there available for your city, your community to take advantage of. So, yeah, I think cynicism might actually be really the best way to think about it. I think there is just a cynical attitude here in the 21st century, for better or worse, and that it's definitely not a world in which boosters like an Amon Carter or others could thrive. They would definitely get laughed off the stage.
Right.
Right. There are things that he does that might have raised a few eyebrows back in the day, but today would definitely make him a figure of mockery. For example, one of the things I mention in my book is that he kind of adopted as his school TCU, Texas Christian University. Even though he had no college education, had really gone no further than the 8th grade, he kind of adopted TCU as the school he would support financially and the football team he would pull for. And in the 1930s, TCU was actually one of the premier football teams in the country. Won a couple of national titles, and then we had a couple of famous quarterbacks come out of there, Sammy Baugh and Davy O'Brien. And Davy O'Brien won the Heisman Trophy in 38. So Carter is this big, TCU supporter, booster. He goes up to New York City for the Heisman ceremonies. Somehow is able to rent, I'm not sure how he got his hands on it, but somehow rented a stagecoach and drove down Wall Street, driving this stagecoach with Davy O'Brien right next to him. And he's like whooping and hollering, just this comical kind of figure on a stagecoach on Wall Street, and people just kind of laughed it off. And, it's like there's kind of this idea, well, that's that Amon Carter guy who's always talking about West Texas, who wears a cowboy hat and carries pistols with him. That's just him playing this character. But, today, there's no way you could get away with that kind of behavior, especially if you're a powerful media mogul.
Right. Yeah, you could just imagine the field day that the Daily Show or Stephen Colbert would have with that type of a thing. Yeah.
And just kind of going off on that, there's actually another incident similar to that that involved H.L. Mencken. H.L. Mencken, obviously incredibly acerbic wit of the day. I like to call him the what's his name, who hosts the show on HBO?
Bill Maher.
Bill Maher.
Yeah, Bill Maher. How am I forgetting that? I'm like right there. I was like, it's not Bill Murray. I know it's an M name. Yeah, right. Yeah. Mencken's kind of that Maher type of character. And so Mencken comes down to Texas for the 28 Democratic Convention, which was going to be hosted down in Houston. As a big shot writer, he stops off in Fort Worth on the way down and kind of links up with Carter. And Mencken, in his writings and his memoirs, you can definitely sense that he's not a real big fan of Carter. And Mencken was not the kind of guy who's going to fall for any boosting efforts of any kind. So he links up with Carter in Fort Worth, takes a train down to Houston with him, and it's very clear from Mencken's memories of the whole event that he was just not real happy on the trip down. He just didn't like hanging out with Carter that much, apparently. So either way, they get down to Houston for the Democratic Convention, and Mencken reports that Carter had arrived at the hotel in Houston, the Rice Hotel, with, in his words, an immense stock of liquors. Obviously it's 28, Prohibition era, but, it's not going to stop Carter from having kept a nice stockpile of alcoholic beverages. So right. Apparently...
A Texan's not going to just agree to that, yeah.
Yeah, he's not. So apparently while he was here at the hotel, at one point, for whatever reason, apparently he was frustrated at waiting too long for the elevator in the hotel. It was just a single passenger elevator. It's the only one in the hotel. It's moving slow. Everybody's crowding in here because it's, Democratic conventions in town. And just out of frustration, he pulled out his pistol Carter did and fired shots at the glass door of the elevator. You'd expect something like that would get him arrested, but law enforcement were like, well, nobody got hurt, so just don't do that again. And so Mencken is like in shock because he sees this whole thing just unfolding in front of them. And then soon after that, Carter is hanging out in Mencken's room, and apparently maybe under the influence, pulls out his pistol and fires a few shots out of the hotel room window. Bullets hit the hotel across the street, apparently near a room where the Ku Klux Klan was having a meeting. And so, obviously this raises quite a bit of a hullabaloo over this, more shooting, and Carter very quickly puts his gun under the mattress and slips out before law enforcement arrives. And the Rangers come in because they figure out the Texas Rangers were there as law enforcement. They arrive. They walk into Mencken's room because they're like, hey, clearly this is where the shots came from. And they arrest H.L. Mencken. And Mencken's like, it wasn't me. It was that Carter guy. And Carter, comes in and tries to, settle the situation. And so what he tells the Rangers, look, if y'all arrest Mencken, it's going to make Texas look ridiculous to the rest of the country. He's known as this peaceable, virtuous character by millions of people. Clearly the shooting had to have happened when Mencken was in the bathroom. Probably some enemy of the Klan slipped in, fired shots out of the window, maybe like when Mencken was flushing the toilet. And, the Rangers are like, well, I guess that could be true. They searched the room. There is no weapon. And so, the whole thing, ended. So Mencken's just reeling from this whole event. And in his mind, it just reinforces this image of Carter that he had, that he's just this, buffoon of a cowboy.
It doesn't say much about the Texas Rangers either.
No, it really doesn't. No gun in here. I don't see it. It's not hanging on the wall. So
well, I guess it could have been while he was in the bathroom.
And so that's the national image that he gets. And this is, like I said, this is when Mencken is kind of at the peak of his powers. And so when he's writing about this, at about the same time that Rogers is, writing tales of his experiences with Carter, that makes Carter, nationally known. I wouldn't necessarily say famous, but he's definitely somebody that your average American, reading the newspaper would have a decent idea of who Carter was and what kind of figure he was. The thing is, there was a previous kind of building on Carter's character here. There is a pre-existing biography of Carter that came out in the 70s. But it wasn't a scholarly biography by any stretch. And in addition, really the author presented Carter as mainly just like this buffoonish cowboy. Clearly, with these kinds of antics, how else could you think of him? But what I really try to show in my biography is that, much of this is very much calculated by Carter. He knows when to play the buffoon. He knows when to put on that cowboy image. But he also knows when to play hardball. He knows how to get the businesses that he wants in Fort Worth, here. He knows how to work with the Roosevelt administration to get money, from various New Deal projects. So it's more of a calculated effort as opposed to just a natural part of his personality.
Cool, and I actually want to follow up on that for a sec, but just mention that James is here. Howdy.
Oh, glad to have you.
Yeah.
Hello. Yeah.
Finally got through that traffic, huh?
Survive traffic.
Glad to have you here.
Thanks. I walked into the middle of a story that I had no context for or idea what was going on. And I really enjoyed the visuals of this crazy person riding down Wall Street, whooping and hollering. And setting up his own personal bar in his hotel room. I think I got that right.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, well, it pretty much was a mobile bar that he carried with him wherever he wanted to go.
Even better.
Yeah, I actually came across, one of the many thousands of papers that are collected in the archive at TCU. A couple of sheets of paper from, I think this was just immediately after Prohibition, but it was a list of the liquor stockpile that he kept. And it was massive. I mean, he definitely, before Prohibition went into effect, put a lot of effort into seeing how much he could set aside to last him throughout Prohibition. And who knows, some of this might have also been acquired under the table during Prohibition. Who knows? He obviously didn't keep records of that. But yeah, I think it's safe to say that some of these behaviors of his probably would not have occurred without the benefit of imbibing a few beverages beforehand.
That always seems to help with
that
that whole generation. I mean, this guy came a little bit earlier, but it makes me think of LBJ in Texas, and I'm sure they probably crossed paths at some point during their careers. But then also out in California, you had Jesse Unruh, who was his nickname was Big Daddy, and he was renowned for drinking and partying, but at the same time was held up as one of the boosters he was a politician, but he was still a booster for California and all of that. And so I kind of miss those days. But at the same time, that role today would probably look a lot like, I don't know, Donald Trump or something today. So it's a very different world we live in.
Yeah, come to
wouldn't it look like Rick Perry?
Yeah, that might be it too. But
Perry, maybe we just haven't heard enough about Perry's personal life to understand that his insanity stems from a love of alcohol and just a general crazy outlook on life.
Yeah, but he's got the whole moral crusader thing going on. These other guys, they didn't even pay lip service to moral
Carter
crusades.
didn't even care.
Yeah,
Carter cared zero for any of that. For any of that element.
Yeah, Unruh that I was talking about was the guy who first made the quote where it's like, for when it comes to like dealing with lobbyists and all that, and he's like, if you can't, drink their booze and blank their women and then vote against them, then what are you doing in politics? He's like, that's just that type of guy that just doesn't care one bit about any moral crusades.
It was a simpler time.
Yeah, the moral majority, Carter would never have been a part of that. You mentioned LBJ, though. That was actually, for a while, a pretty strong friendship and partnership between the two of them. Carter had really come out strongly in support of LBJ back when LBJ first ran for the Senate in 1941, and failed attempt by Johnson, but they formed a really close partnership in all of that. And Carter, I think from his perspective, felt that he was maybe taking Johnson under his wing. Johnson, of course, was not the kind of politician who was going to remain under anybody's wing. So, Johnson does end up breaking free, if you will, of Carter by the early 1950s. And that actually created a bit of a rift between the two of them. And Johnson just did not vote the way Carter wanted on some things, and Carter called off the friendship, just completely severed that relationship that he had with Johnson. Which actually apparently bothered both Lyndon and Lady Bird. She called it one of the saddest episodes of that period of the Johnsons' life. Was just Carter just completely cutting them off because of supporting a few things that Carter didn't want him to support. But nevertheless, there for about a decade, they were incredibly close. Carter did try to take different members of Congress under his wing if he could, because he figured he could, they could be useful for him in a variety of ways. But once they had outgrown or outlived their usefulness, then he was not afraid to cut them off.
I just wanted to correct my quote from Jesse Unruh. It's the proper quote is, if you can't eat their food, drink their booze, blank their women, take their money, and then vote against them, you've got no business being up here. That's California politics for the 1950s. My 60s,
wow.
I guess.
Fantastic.
Yeah. That was my dissertation era. That guy was amazing to study.
That's Republican virtue, right? As the founders would have called it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, not so much.
All right, and so you kind of touched on it a little bit, but so his politics, Carter, he was a Democrat. He kind of traveled in circles, but back in those days, Democrat, Republican, it was the partisan lines weren't as clearly drawn as they are today, and so there were a lot of kind of politics getting mixed up, and both parties agreed on a lot more things than they agree on today. And so if Carter is kind of this booster, he must be appealing to people on all sides of the aisle, I imagine. He's probably putting up his best front to try to get everybody possible to be involved here. So did you see him kind of like, not flip-flopping, but, kind of being open to all comers kind of a thing?
Well, when Carter is at his peak, it's a period where Texas is still very much a one-party state. The Republican Party is in shambles for really most of the 20th century, really up until not until the 1960s and the 70s does the Texas Republican Party really begin to solidify and gain any real support. So for him, he had the luxury, I guess you'd say, of just being able to be a Democrat and not have to worry about anybody on the other side of the aisle. But that said, during the 1920s, when you have those Republican administrations, especially of Coolidge and Hoover, Carter did try to make nice with them as much as possible. As partisan as he was, he at the same time wasn't about to go out of his way to antagonize Republican administrations, just because you never know when these kinds of individuals could be useful. So, for example, there toward the end of Harding's term in office, Carter works closely with Hoover as Secretary of Commerce to get a radio station up and running, and that would serve as the radio arm of the Star-Telegram. And Hoover was actually the one who ends up naming the radio station. He gave it the call letters of WBAP, which stood for We Bring a Program. And that was one of the first radio stations west of the Mississippi River. And it was had a very strong signal, so it was a radio station you would hear not just in Texas, but in some neighboring states. So it was a way for Carter to really extend the reach of the Star-Telegram. But, he needs politicians to do things like that for him, so he's not really going to be too antagonistic towards Republicans. When Roosevelt, wins in 1933, Carter really went into overdrive, cultivating a relationship with Roosevelt. He was assisted in this by the fact that one of Roosevelt's children, one of his sons, Elliot, actually lived in Fort Worth at the time. Elliot Roosevelt had married a local girl, and so they were living here, and so Carter is able to get direct access to Franklin through his son Elliot, and he's definitely not afraid to use that channel as much as possible. So one of the things that he really pursues is getting a variety of funding for different projects locally. He helps secure PWA and RFC funding of a major complex in the city that ends up being named after Will Rogers, because it's built right after Will Rogers died in 1935 in a plane crash. And so he secures around $1 million for the construction of this complex that would serve as the place to house a long-held local stock show. It's called the Southwestern Exposition and Fat Stock Show. Basically it's kind of like a state fair type thing. But nevertheless, secured New Deal funding for all of the buildings that would house that. Funnily enough, that there wasn't really something that all members of the Roosevelt administration were happy about. This request, since a lot of it was for PWA funding, had to go through Harold Ickes, who was the head of the Public Works Administration and was notoriously a little bit tight-fisted with the money. And he took to just mocking this whole project and called it Amon's Cowsheds. Why do we want to spend $1 million on Amon's Cowsheds? This is pointless. But Carter, again, has this direct route to Franklin Roosevelt. Carter is also pretty good friends with Jesse Jones, who is the head of the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Close friends with Vice President John Nance Garner, and so he's able to outnumber someone like Harold Ickes, and so he gets the money he needs for this major construction project. So the desire to get those kinds of dollars flowing into Fort Worth during the Depression definitely gave Carter an incentive to stay on Roosevelt's good side. At the same time, Carter was not afraid to criticize some parts of the New Deal that he thought, at least in his perspective, went too far, especially in Roosevelt's second term. Carter really thought that the Roosevelt administration had become too pro-labor, for example, so he was not afraid to criticize Roosevelt for that. But at the same time, he was always careful to couch his criticism in a way to where it would not cost him access. And at the same time, Roosevelt, as much as he might not like that kind of criticism, understood that Carter was useful. Like I said, Carter had the most widely circulated, most widely read newspaper in Texas. That's not really a newspaper you want turning against you too much. So Roosevelt is not going to go out of his way to, maybe push Carter away from him. So I think both Roosevelt and Carter understood that there was something they needed from the other individual. Carter needed the money from the New Deal, and Roosevelt needed the political support. So they're willing to overlook whatever differences they have in order to make sure they get what they feel is in their best interests.
That also probably goes to something we were talking about back at the very beginning of all this, when we were talking about boosters not being as welcome today as they were back then. But of course, you just bring up a good point that this is happening during the Great Depression. And so, yeah, I'm sure anybody, to most people, I'm sure it was like anybody that's bringing work here or bringing money here, more power to them. we're not gonna lock them out of the room like we possibly would today. We're a bit more affluent all around, so we're probably not. So now we don't really care all that much about it. But back then, it's like, hey, he brought some jobs. Let him. Don't mock him. Keep him going.
There's a lot more at stake.
Yeah,
and he keeps doing that during World War II. Carter was actually someone who was pretty pro-American involvement even before we got involved in the war. He definitely was not part of any kind of isolationist wing of the Democratic Party. So he was pretty happy when we got into the war. And he was able to use his already existing connections with the Roosevelt administration to help ensure that more monies would be flowing in to the city, especially when it came to putting the economy on a wartime footing and building up, that arsenal of democracy. So one thing that Carter is successful in getting is a consolidated aircraft plant constructed in Fort Worth, which at the time that it was built, it was the longest building in the country. Carter made sure like several inches were added to the length of it to make it the longest building in the country at the time. That was the kind of person he was. But, you've probably all seen that image of B-24 Liberators being constructed in World War II. It's just this, as far as the eye can see, these B-24s that was here in Fort Worth at the consolidated plant. That provided construction or jobs for, thousands of individuals. As a matter of fact, my great-grandfather worked as an upholsterer at the consolidated plant in World War II. Something I actually didn't find out until fairly recently. But, so it's something that, locals, they looked at that and in their eyes, when they see that consolidated plant constructed and, whenever it's completed, they see that really as an example of Carter and his devotion to the community. So he definitely was a figure that, at least locally, was seen as really a giant in the community. Most Fort Worthians weren't really going to be too critical of him because, to be honest, by the end of the 40s, early 50s, there were estimates that 1 in 4 Fort Worth workers had a job primarily working at a place that was here because of Carter's efforts.
Is there any big themes in your book or in your research that we haven't touched on yet?
Well, one thing I really try to incorporate throughout the book is really trying to provide some answer to the question of, is Carter, and therefore by extension Fort Worth, a southern or a western city? In the present day, Worth, it tries to present itself as very much a western-oriented city. As a matter of fact, the slogan of the Star-Telegram, which Amon Carter put there in the early 1920s, was that Fort Worth was where the West begins. Part of it, kind of hidden in that, is kind of mockery at Dallas, that Dallas is where the East peters out, as they put it, And so Fort Worth is where the West begins.
Okay.
Nevertheless, there is that sense of a Western identity. And so, in looking back at Carter and really just kind of this city that he's operating in, I'm trying to figure out, is that really the case? Is this a Western city, or, are there more Southern elements to it than people want to talk about? And of course, when you're talking about Southern identity, especially in the first half of the 20th century, you're primarily thinking of things like race, right? Jim Crow, segregation, disfranchisement. And one thing that we do see is that Fort Worth was very much a Southern city in that regard. It might have a Western orientation in a lot of ways, and it might have connections to that Western past as a city of cattle and things like that. But there was a very much a strong Southern element to its identity, because it was a city where Jim Crow was just as much a part of the city as it was in any other city in Texas or other parts of the South. And so one thing I did look at is how Carter fit into that. One thing that we do see is that Carter definitely does not buck that system by any stretch of the imagination. He's just like many other white residents of Fort Worth at the time. He accepts segregation, and in his eyes, kind of the natural order of things. There are things that he just kind of takes for granted that we would be shocked by today. For example, in 1913, there was a horrific lynching in Dallas, and Carter hops on the little interurban railway that connected Fort Worth to Dallas at the time, and goes over there and covers the event, and then very quickly gets a special edition of the Star-Telegram printed out, talking about this lynching and publicizing this lynching. And then he goes out and on his own, starts selling newspapers in Dallas and surrounding communities to try to get the news of this lynching out before everybody else did. And just the kind of casual manner in which he does this illustrates that in his mind, this was just, it was a lynching. There was nothing particularly horrifying about the event. Yes, it was newsworthy, but not newsworthy in the kind of way in which you would be critical of it. So in that sense, Carter was very much a Southerner. There is another moment in the 1920s which reveals that Southern identity, if you will, of Carter. He's on the Pennsylvania Railroad on a train, traveling with one of the most widely read syndicated columnists of the 20s, a guy by the name of O.O. McIntyre. He had a syndicated column that appeared in hundreds of newspapers at the time. And Carter is not pleased with how one of the African-American waiters on the train speaks to him. And he just gets up and he slaps the waiter so hard the guy falls into Amon Carter's seat. And Carter just kind of, for Carter, that was just how you handle things. Interestingly enough, McIntyre, even though he was definitely not a Southerner, in some of his correspondence with Amon after the fact, McIntyre doesn't seem to be too shocked by the whole thing. And so it's incredibly eye-opening to see that kind of behavior. Here's someone who, on the surface presents this very ebullient, effusive, outgoing personality, rah-rah, boosterism, but, at the same time is not afraid to, do his part to enforce segregation. But then at the same time, as he gets older, I wouldn't say that Carter softens, but he does begin to present himself as more of a paternal kind of figure for the African-American community in Fort Worth. So providing funding for parks in African-American neighborhoods, things like that. Going out of his way to help provide relief for local African-Americans after a particularly horrific flood of the Trinity River in 1949. So in a sense, by the end of his life, it seems that Carter may have softened a little bit of the edges as far as his attitude toward race was concerned. But at the same time, he wasn't going to do anything he was not going to do anything that would weaken segregation or Jim Crow. I think he'd really arrived at this attitude that As long as they, quote, know their place, then yes, I can play that more paternalistic kind of role in the lives of local African Americans. So that's something I definitely tried to incorporate throughout my book, was looking at those racial attitudes and how they changed or didn't change throughout his life, and against that whole backdrop of race relations in general in this part of Texas.
Interesting that you're bringing up the kind of the desire to pursue a Western identity instead of a Southern identity. Again, another parallel to California is that in a lot of my schooling was on Western history, not just U.S. history, but Western U.S. history. And so there's always been this kind of long-running thread of conversation among historians and among boosters and all of that about whether, what is the West? What is the region of the West? Does Texas count as the West? Does California count as the West? I mean, obviously from a geographic perspective, sure, California, it's the West Coast, so sure, it fits with the West. However, there is so much that's different about California and about Texas, because California doesn't look a whole lot like Utah or, Nevada or some of the other far western states that are easily definable as the West. California's got a much more diverse environment, a much more diverse economy, much more diverse people, a lot more people. California's kind of the same, Texas is kind of the same thing. It's got a lot more people. It's much more populated than what we kind of envision as the West. So it's interesting to see that play out with Texas, is that they're embracing their southernness, but they're also pursuing their westernness, if that's a word.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And then that's definitely a theme that a lot of Texas historians are picking up today, especially as relates to, for example, the Texas Centennial back in 1936. That's where you really begin to see a huge effort aimed at seeing Texas more as a Western as opposed to a Southern state. And really a lot of it goes back to those Southern themes that really end up coming back to defeat and despair at the end of the Civil War. Well, that's not exactly the kind of triumphant vision that Texans wanted to adopt for themselves as they're celebrating the Texas Centennial. So what do you see? You see a lot of efforts aimed at cultivating a more westward-oriented vision of the past, because that did seem at the time to be a much more triumphant vision. It was a vision of victory and progress, as opposed to emphasizing this lost cause and memory of defeat.
Right.
I think a lot of present day Texas's identity as Western, though most Texans might not be aware of it, it's definitely deliberately cultivated in the 1920s and 30s. It's not something that was just kind of organic.
Right. Yeah. It's hitching your cart to like you said, to a victory, because the victory over the Native Americans and all of that. It's also kind of the West with the conventional wisdom of the West as a place of constant reinvention. You're not tied to the past. You're kind of blazing into a glorious future, resources be damned, people there be damned, whatever. But you're gonna, but it's a place of newness. I mean, even going all the way back to Frederick Jackson Turner and his whole frontier thesis and all that, where people are reinventing themselves on the West. You reinvent democracy, you reinvent industry, you reinvent your self-image, you completely reinvent yourself, you reinvent your country, you reinvent your city. So it does make sense, especially like you said, you're trying to get out from under the cloud of the lost cause and the cloud of the loss of the Civil War and all of that. It certainly makes sense to try to grab onto something that's new and victorious and something that can kind of drag you out of the past, so to speak.
Yeah, and you don't, throughout Carter's, correspondence, you never really get much of a sense that he's even all that aware of the Civil War.
Yeah.
It's just not a cloud that lingers over him in any way, shape, or form. But he definitely is obsessed with the West, which explains the last thing I guess I'll mention about the book and Carter is, when he gets incredibly wealthy in the 1930s, thanks to wildcatting, independently discovering oil in West Texas. He uses a lot of that wealth, partially for philanthropy. He was real philanthropic in a variety of ways, but he also devoted a lot of efforts to collecting the art of Frederick Remington and Charles Russell, because he really loved their mythic vision portrayal of the West. conquest of the West. And so he amassed a huge collection of their art. And then in his will, he stated that he wanted a museum to be established that would be permanently free to the public to showcase his art. And so, we have a museum, the Amon Carter Museum, which used to be called the Amon Carter Museum of Western Art, but now it's just devoted broadly to American art. But the centerpiece of that collection is a large collection of Remington and Russells, that really fit in with what Carter thought the West was like, or what it should have been like.
That sounds awesome. Well, in a way, it sounds awesome. From a historical perspective, it sounds awesome. I don't know about from an artistic perspective. It's awesome.
Definitely. So, I would just say, it's kind of funny, your California connection. You would kind of assume that Carter might, have a fascination with California. But interestingly enough, he didn't really have that kind of fascination with California. He in a lot of ways, he was very oriented toward places like Chicago and New York and Washington, D.C. So, I never really understood why, someone like Carter wouldn't really see California as another example of the kind of place he envisioned the West should be.
And California's always been kind of troublesome in that, but I wonder if, and you would know this better than I would, but I wonder if maybe it's just because of his attraction to power and influence. In California back in the 30s and 40s, California, ever since the gold rush has been kind of a special part of the country, but it also really wasn't the seat of power really until after World War II.
Yeah, that definitely is true. So that gravitates toward the seats of power. He already has the opportunity here. He doesn't need a place like California for that.
Right. Yeah. California would be like a lateral
starting
move.
all over again.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's great. Well, this is a really cool topic, and I look forward to reading the book. This sounds like there's if any of the stories you've been telling here are in there, then I'm looking forward to those stories. So thank you very much for joining us today.
And thank you for having me. Enjoyed the whole conversation.
Definitely. Sorry that I showed up a bit late, but it was enough of a teaser to make me go out and buy the book.
I'll make sure to share with you all the Amazon link when that becomes available.
Nice. Is it up on the publisher's link site yet? Do you know?
Not just yet. At least not that they have shared with me. I just actually went through the whole proofing process, got my proofs back to them last month, index back to them last month. So now just sitting and waiting.
Yeah.
So I assume it'll be up on their site within a month or two.
Okay. Well, yeah, when you get that, send
share
it
all
to
that
me
with you all.
Yeah, I'll put it up on the, I put it up in the episode notes and the, what do you call that thing? Twitter. That's what you call it. I'll put it up on there too.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
No, thank you. This was great. It was good to meet you.
Enjoyed talking to both of you and meeting with you all. And
yeah, this is great.
And thank you all for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments on this podcast or suggestions for future episodes, as always, send me an email at workinghistorians@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter at filibusterhist, although that will probably have to change with all this rebranding. Well, that's a problem for another day. Anyway, for James Fennessy and Brian Cervantez, I am Rob Denning. I'll see you in 2 weeks.